Okay, we're looking tonight at another parable. You probably will recognize that we went through this parable not too long ago on another series. It's called the Parable of the Talents. But I want to read it again for you. It's a lengthy parable, but it's very important to see the flow that takes place here. So let's begin in the 25th chapter of Matthew, and we'll start in verse 14 and we'll go through verse 30. It's a lengthy passage, but I think the message itself will be a little shorter, so maybe that'll help. And 25:14 says, "For the kingdom of heaven is as a man traveling into a far country, who called his own servants and delivered unto them his goods. And unto one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1. To every man according to his several ability, and straightway took his journey. Then he that had received the 5 talents went and traded with the same, and made them other 5 talents. And likewise he that had received 2, he also gained other 2. But he that received 1 went and digged in the earth, and hid his Lord's money. After a long time the Lord of those servants cometh, and reckoneth with them. And so he that had received 5 talents came and brought other 5 talents, saying, Lord, thou deliverest unto me 5 talents. Behold, I have gained beside them 5 talents more. His Lord said unto him, Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Enter thou into thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. He also that had received 2 talents came and said, Lord, thou deliveredest unto me 2 talents. Behold, I have gained 2 other talents beside them. His Lord said unto him, Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. Then he which had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew thee that thou art a hard man, reaping where thou hast not sown, and gathering where thou hast not strawed. And I was afraid, and I went and hid thy talent in the earth. Lo, there thou hast that is thine. His Lord answered and said unto him, Thou wicked and slothful servant, thou knewest that I reaped where I sowed not, gathered where I have not strawed. Thou oughtest therefore to have put my money to the exchangers, and then in my coming I should have received mine own with usury. Take therefore the talent from him, and give it unto him which hath 10 talents. For unto every one that hath shall be given, and he that shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. And cast ye the unprofitable servant into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Well, it's a well-known parable. Herbert Lockyer, in his commentary, gives this introduction. Let me read it to you. He says, "There was no break between the utterance of the previous parable," that's the one of the 10 virgins, "and this one. Jesus, continuing his last words to his own, added the parable of the talents as a needful complement to that of the virgins." End of quotation. So verse 13 ends the parable of the virgins, and the next verse begins with a causal connector, the word for. This indicates a connection between the 2 parables. So concluding his analysis of the previous parable, the virgins, Lockyer says this: "The question for each heart to answer is, will I be ready when the bridegroom comes?" End of quotation. So it seems that both parables are indicating preparation for an expected event sometime in the future. So the theme seems to shout out to us that we're to be prepared for any anticipated event. So how then does this next parable connect with the idea of the virgins? I want us to examine both of them together. Lockyer says this. In the previous one, he says, and I'm quoting, "In the virgins, Jesus revealed the necessity of attending to inward character. But here in the talents, he combined that necessity with a strong enforcement of outward exertion." End of quotation. So the virgins tells us to watch for his return in readiness. The talents advise us to work earnestly until he returns. So both parables teach the principle of personal accountability, and I want to examine the parable of the talents more specifically. So first of all, we need to understand what a talent is. I heard a preacher preach on this some years ago, and he talked about people having the talent to play the piano, the talent to teach, the talent to do this. Well, that's not what the word talent is here. The word talent has nothing to do with a natural skill. It's a unit of measurement which was common in both the Old and the New Testament period. A talent of money, for example, equaled approximately 350 pounds, usually of silver or of gold. In the account before us then, if we take the talent at the time that it was actually spoken of here in this, he's talking about giving the 5-talent man $5,000. Be much more today. The 2-talent man, $2,000, and the 1-talent man, $1,000. So they received a certain amount of money, not the ability to play an instrument or do something like that. So keep in mind, this was during the time when a day's wage for the average worker was about a denarius, or what we would say approximately 1 cent. That was the day's wage. So these 3 men were entrusted with a lot of money when you look at it in terms of a day's wage. So the second thing I'd like for us to do is examine the specifics of the parable. First thing is we define talent. Second thing is we look at the specifics. And there are several specifics that we need to understand. First is the kingdom of heaven. Number 1, the kingdom of heaven. Verse 14, he says, for the kingdom of heaven is as. And you know, of course, that like and as introduce a simile. And a simile is a comparison of 2 or more things. So he's saying the eternal kingdom of heaven is very much like what I'm about to talk about here, a man talking to his servants and then going off and coming back. Lockyer points out here that the phrase, the kingdom of heaven, is in italics, which means that it was not in the original text, but was added by the translators for the sake of smoothness, meaning the translators knew that the 2 parables went together, and so they carry over the idea of the Son of Man from the first parable into the second parable. So that links verse 14 as a continuation of verse 13, talking specifically about the Son of Man. So Jesus actually applied the parable to himself. As in the case of the previous parables, the main theme relates to the spiritual realm, and the spiritual realm is illustrated with ideas associated with the temporal realm. So that's number 1. Number 2, let's look at the traveling man. He says, as a man traveling into a far country who called his own servants, verse 14. So what we have here is a figure of authority, which is very similar to all the other parables that we have looked at in the book of Matthew. For example, in Matthew 22:1 and following, we have a certain king, a person in authority, who called people to a wedding feast. And then in Matthew 21:28 and following, we have a statement, a certain man had 2 sons, and he told them to go work in his vineyard. So the authority there is a father figure. And then we have Matthew 21:33, a certain householder. So there we have a man who has unfaithful tenants working his farm, working his land, and he sends out servants to check on them, and they abuse his authority. And then we have another man who is a householder in Matthew 20, verses 1 and following. He was the one that went out and hired laborers to come and work in his field, and he hired them at different times during the day. But in all 4 cases, we have an authority figure, just as we do in this parable that deals with the kingdom of heaven. So because of rejection by the Pharisees, by the chief priests and some of the people, Jesus, or the Father, is presented in all 4 or all 5 parables as the offended authority figure. So if we're looking at this from the standpoint of authority and those under authority, then the idea in all of the parables is that there is an accountability to legitimate authority. So how is the authority clarified in this parable? In other words, what can we find in the parable, staying right in the context, what can we find in the parable that legitimizes the authority of the traveler who goes into a foreign country? Number 1, he is declared the owner of his own servants, verse 14. So if he is the authoritative figure over those servants, then his authority is reinforced. Secondly, he is the one who decides how to distribute his own goods to the servants, verses 14 and 15. So he is declared owners of servants first, verse 14. Then he decides how to distribute his own goods to his servants, verses 14 and 15. Only one in authority could have done that. And then thirdly, he decides how, when, and where to take his journey. He doesn't ask anybody's permission. He just decides to leave after handling everything the way he thought it should be handled. So he decides how, when, and where to take his journey. That reinforces his authority. That's verse 15. And then number 4, he determines his own reckoning with each of his servants, verse 19. He comes back and he calls them into account to himself. And they don't argue the point. They actually come and submit their findings and their accountability to him. So he determines his own reckoning with each of his servants. That's number 4. That's found in verse 19. Another reinforcement of his authority is that during the reckoning with each of the servants, verses 20 through 25, each one addresses him as Lord. Each one addresses him as Lord. That solidifies his authority in the parable. And then number 6, he determines both the reward and the punishment for the actions of each of the servants. He determines both the reward and the punishment for each of the actions of the servants. So how is the authority clarified in this parable? Number 1, declared owner of his own servants, verse 14. Number 2, he decides how to distribute his own goods to his servants, verses 14 and 15. Thirdly, he decides how, when, and where to take his own journey, verse 15. Number 4, he determines his own reckoning with each of the servants, verse 19. And number 5, during the reckoning period, the servants call him Lord, verses 20 through 25. And then number 6, he determines both reward and punishment for the actions of his servants, verses 20 through 30. That indicates that he is in authority. Now, there are 2 parallel ideas in the parable if we go from observation, interpretation, and application. First of all, it is very clear that since we're in a messianic book, the book of Matthew, and it's very clear that since Jesus is presenting himself to his people as the Messiah, the relationship between Israel and the Lord is the primary context of the parable. So what we're looking at here is their obligation to their Lord. The second relationship that we're looking at here, parallel, is by application. We can say that even today, even though this is not to the church, those of us who are in the church are going to meet the Lord at the judgment seat of Christ, 1 Corinthians chapter 3. And so by application, we're looking at our relationship to our Lord in this parable, by application. So we looked at the kingdom of heaven. We're studying heavenly things which are illustrated by things familiar on earth. And then we're looking at the traveling man and the relationship between mankind and divine authority. Look at number 3. Let's look at each of the servants. The servants. In the parable of the talents, Jesus is addressing his own disciples. If you go back to the 24th chapter and begin looking in verse 1 and following, what you'll find is that Jesus has taken his disciples apart and he's talking to them, not to the crowd. So while the theme of each parable is general enough to apply nationally to the nation of Israel, they are specific enough to be directed by Jesus to each of the disciples to whom he's speaking. In addition to that, though this is a messianic book, the principles which surface in the parable can also apply to us. William Taylor, a New Testament scholar, relates the parable to the cultural pattern of the day. And here's what he says that fits right in with it. I'm quoting now. It's a lengthy quotation. Follow carefully. When a wealthy man was leaving his home for a while, 2 courses of action were open to him for the arrangement of his affairs. Either he might make his confidential slaves his agents, committing to them the tilling of his land and giving them enough money to handle all of the responsibilities and to be used by them in trade. Or he might take advantage of the money-changing system, which had been introduced in Rome by the Phoenicians and was at that time in full operation in the entire Roman Empire. The Lord adopted the former of these courses, and there was at least a tacit understanding that the servants would be rewarded for their fidelity to their master. End of quotation. So you remember the caveat that I keep giving you when we study the parables? It is this: the parable has one main idea to convey. We call that its theme, its thesis. It is not always wise to try to take every little aspect of a parable and try to force some kind of significant spiritual meaning onto it. What you're looking for in the parable is usually one main idea, and in many cases it will be stated somewhere in the parable. Now look at these phrases, for example, or words that appear in the parable. Verse 14, the words his goods. These are the owner's resources, and they could include anything. They could include money, they could include tangible elements that would be used in farming, be anything. Talents, verse 15 and following. These are monetary units common during the period of time the New Testament also used in the Old Testament. Verse 18, the servant that was slothful was reprimanded for not handling his Lord's money. So money then, mentioned in verse 18, clarifies that the talents were money. They were either silver or gold, probably. And then the word gained is used in verse 20 and verse 22. This indicates that a material investment was expected by the Lord, or a benefit should have accrued as a result of the action of the servant. The word usury appears in verse 27, and this is a word that has to be looked at in context. Good usury, for example, would be like our talking about earning interest on our income, okay? It would be the acceptable interest level of the day on an investment or a loan. But there were some who abused the idea of usury. That was the bad group. And what they would do, they were in a position of advantage over people that were really hurting or distressed. Remember when Nehemiah was rebuilding the walls? He had to step in and tell some of the wealthier Jews to quit charging high interest rates to their brothers. So that would be bad usury. They would charge more than was considered reasonable by the market. Now the servants, as presented in this parable, they reflect both similarities and differences. We look at these servants and we can find things that are similar between each of them and things that are different. So why don't we start off with the differences? The Lord's judgment of each one of them was based upon his observation over time as to their performance. And when he gives them different levels of responsibility, is because he's made a judgment looking at how they performed over a period of time. 5 talents to one, 2 talents to another, 1 talent to the last one. This seems to refer to their demonstrated ability at managing resources. They were obviously all different. The householder had decided which one should receive the 5, which the 2, and which the 1. And from an applicational standpoint, let me give you this. Don't be afraid to use what God has given you. A lot of people justify, not serving the Lord because they can't do what so-and-so can do. They can't do what this person can do. They don't have that skill. Never feel inferior because of God's determination of your assignment. Matter of fact, Warren Wiersbe points out, he said, this servant that had the 1 talent was not punished by his master because he had 1 talent. His master tells him why he was being punished, because he was slothful. He did not do what he was assigned to do. So the penalty had nothing. If he had gained another 1, everything would have been okay. You see that the man with 5 talents had 100% return, the man with 2 had 100% return, and if the guy with 1 had invested his with the money changers, he probably would also have had a 100% investment. So he wasn't penalized for being a 1 talent person. He was penalized for being slothful and not doing what he was supposed to do. Another difference between them seems to be their attitude toward the resources with which the master entrusted them. The master of the servants took his journey straightway. The word means immediately. So he gave 5, 2, and 1, and then without any discussion, he just took off and left, which indicates that this may not have been the first time this happened. The master of the servants, not knowing how long he would be gone, just simply told them to handle everything while he was gone. And since they had no indication how long that he would be gone, the 5-talent man, the 2-talent man immediately went to the exchangers and started investing what they had. The 1-talent man simply wrapped it up and hid it in the ground. 2 of them had a responsible attitude toward what they were entrusted with. One had an irresponsible attitude to what he had been entrusted with. And you and I are different, but our differences do not justify our having an irresponsible attitude toward that which God has entrusted to us. So I can't look at you and say, since I'm not like you, I'm going to go hide over here. You can't look at me and say, well, since I'm not like you, I'm going to go hide over here. Everybody is important in the work of the Lord. Another difference seems to be the level of rewards for their conduct. The 5-talent man, 2-talent man both praised and promoted. The 1-talent man rebuked and demoted. And interestingly, the only person who made excuses was the irresponsible 1-talent man. He was the one who hid his Lord's money. And then he blamed his Lord for his hiding his Lord's money. I knew about you, so I hid your money. So if you and I want our Lord's praise, what it's saying to us is this: we ought to handle what we have been entrusted with in a way which he approves. Eternal outcomes, by the way, depend upon our present performance. That's what the judgment seat of Christ is all about. Eternal outcomes depend upon our present performance. Well, those are some differences. Let me close by referring to some similarities between these servants. First of all 3 of them were under the same Lord or master. Secondly, all 3 were established as servants. There's no indication that they were newly hired or newly approved. So they were all under the same Lord and master. They were all seemingly established servants. Thirdly, all 3 were entrusted with a designated responsibility. So they were told up front what they had to manage. 5, 2, and 1. And that's all they were going to be held accountable for. The 1-talent man wasn't going to be held accountable for the 5-talent man's investments. All 3 were expected to invest wisely. They were all 3 expected to invest wisely. We find that out when the Lord confronts them on the return. And then we find out another similarity. All 3 were held accountable by the same Lord under which they served. Commenting on the first 2 servants, Herbert Lockyer says this: these 2 servants were unlike in the talents received, but they were alike in obedience to their master, in diligence and in faithfulness, and so they received a like reward. This reminds us that it is not fame, but faithfulness that will win the master's approval when he returns to reward his own. End of quotation. So the 1-talent servant was rebuked, judged, had his talent taken away and given to the 10-talent man. And Lockyer, in the commentary in the last paragraph, draws this conclusion on page 246. He said, this wicked servant did not bury his talent because he had only 1, but because he was a wicked and slothful servant. End of quotation. And Jesus had been talking to the 12 about their responsibilities. He had given them keys, authority to operate. He had told them that he was going to establish his church. And he told them that they would be responsible to carry out his work when he went to Jerusalem, was crucified, buried, and rose again. So he's talking to them about their responsibilities. The principle of wise use with what God has entrusted to them, that same principle applies to us today. Whatever you believe God has entrusted to you in your life, quoting the words from the very famous song that we've sung here before. Give of your best to the Master. Let's stand together for prayer. Lord, help us to be the best at what you want us to be. Help us not, if we have one talent, to look at the 5-talent person and be jealous and desire what he has. Help us to use the 1 talent you've given us. Help us, whatever you've invested us with, to be considered important, to be treated responsibly, and to realize that at some point we'll have to give account to you for how we managed this life that we have. Thank you for loving us. Thank you for our church. Thank you for all that you do to help us meet every obligation we have. Speak to our hearts now in this invitation, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.